Hi, Carmen.
Hi, Jason. How are you?
Good. Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I always enjoy telling the story of Mount Tabor and the mountain in Cedar Street neighborhood story that's where I grew up. So I enjoy talking about it, and especially about Mount Tabor and the cemetery.
Yeah, we're going to hear all about it. We have Carmen James with us, and you are what town are you in right now?
Okay. I'm in Mount Holly Springs, Pennsylvania. That's in central PA. We're very lucky to be in the center of the Keystone State. And it's located, I would say, about 30 odd miles from our capital, which is Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we happen to be located on a path that was significant for the Civil War because we had the Confederate Army march through our town, and we have some history about that. And the uniqueness about Mount Holly Springs, and specifically the Mountain Street, Cedar Street area, is that it has been an African American community since the 1800s. The It was filled with both formerly enslaved residents and free African Americans, and that's something we're very proud of. That and the surrounding buildings and cemeteries that we have.
You have been involved with local nonprofits, and of course, we're going to talk about Mount Tabor and the church and all of the amazing preservation happenings surrounding that. Dr. Lindsay Varner, alluded to the project in a conversation I had with her. Let's back up a little bit, though. You said you grew up in Mount Holly at least for a time.
Yes. Uh, my family moved to Mountain Street, Mount Holly Springs, in 1951 when I was two, and so I lived on this street, grew up on this street, and until 1969 when I left. And uh, that date is sort of memorable because the next year Mount Tabor closed. So I was like the rest of the people that grew up or lived on Mountain Street. As a teenager, you can hardly wait to move into adulthood, to get out into the world.
Right.
And I eventually ended up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, living in one of the suburbs of Philadelphia and working for a bank for 31 years. And so I think the experience that I bring from working with a bank, I was in branch banking. So the experience that I have talking, engaging people, not being afraid to ask for money or to ask for donations, three things, which is very important, that anybody that's working with a nonprofit, you have to feel really comfortable with talking, telling your story. People call it a supermarket line story. I call it an elevator story because you
Elevator
only have,
speech.
yeah, elevator speech, because you only have from one floor to the next to get your line across. So working in banking and interacting with people spontaneously is something that gives me, I think, a gift in what I'm currently doing. I retired in 2003. My husband and I always knew we were going to be moving back to Mount Holly Springs. I don't know why. It's just a draw. In fact, a number of our board members in the Mount Holly Preservation Project, Mount Tabor Preservation Project,
Hmm.
um, are have relocated back to Mount Holly from other places. So we always knew that we were going to be moving back, and I basically live right beside the house that I grew up in, which is also, it has a plaque from the Cumberland County Historical Society for Historical Places. It's circa 1878.
Wow.
And it was a two up, two down log construction with cladding. It's now under aluminum siding because that was what my father put on to stop painting every 5 years.
Everybody
Um,
was doing that, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's still there. My hope would be someday that my brothers would decide to take it off, but then who's going
Hmm.
to paint it? Um,
Did
but
your parents come? Did they move? Were Mount Holly? What were the reasons that they moved there?
My father grew up in Carlisle. So his family has always been in Carlisle. I'm not sure, probably not always, because they came from Virginia, Front Royal. Virginia. But he grew up, he was born in 1918, and he grew up in Carlisle. My mother came from the Midwest. She grew up in Sullivan, Indiana, and she came with her brother and his wife to the War College, which is another industry in Carlisle. It's an army post, and she moved with them because her brother's wife was having a baby and was having problems. So she moved with them to help take care of her. And she met my father and they married. And I think they used to, I guess, in the 40s, there wasn't a whole lot to do, and they would ride around and they would come to Holly, and they would drive down Mountain Street. And the story, because this is our story with Mount Tabor, is all about stories. And my story as a family is they would drive down Mountain Street and they would always see that house. And my father was working with someone who mentioned to him that he had applied for a mortgage, a GI loan, to buy this house. And my dad was like, came home and told my mother, and my mom said, and my dad said to him, if it falls through, let me know, because I know where that house is. It's got good bones. And so, yeah, it has good bones. No electricity, no water, but it had good bones. So it did have electricity. They had electricity. They put it in 1950, the year before they moved in, one light bulb. So anyway, it fell through, and my mother called the real estate agent here in Holly, and she said, yeah, that fell through. It's up for sale. And so they bought it for $2,500. They bought it. And it has like a set of 3 deeds that I still have. And the earliest deed, we couldn't say that the house was built on that date, but the earliest deed we have is 1866 for a parcel. It's 3 parcels that were put together, and one of them has a deed of 1866. So I love the house. I live next door to it, and I cut the grass every summer for it. And my mom is going to be 94 this year, and she still knows where every piece of valued treasure is in that house. So,
wow. Even the hidden ones too.
The hidden ones. Yes. I hide them under the bed.
Now, how was Mount Holly at the time? Was it a tight-knit community, or I guess that there were different communities, I imagine?
Our community was tight-knit. And I think that's why there's such a draw to preserve the church and the cemetery, because it was a tight knit, and everything hinged around Sundays. You went to Sunday school on Sundays, you had your gardens, you listened to the stories on the front porch of the Gumby family that Anna Gumby used to tell. Her name is Harriet Ann Parker Gumby. She married a Gumby, and she was the daughter of Elias Parker. And when you're young and you're sitting there listening to her stories, you don't realize that she was the daughter of an enslaved Civil War veteran, that you're basically listening to stories. And I wish I could tell you I have them all in memory. I don't. But what I do remember is the calmness, and sitting on the front porch with the rest of the kids in the neighborhood, just watching her glide back and forth on the glider, and just talk about what it was growing up and the things that her father told us. She did tell us that his uniform was in the attic, and that house has since been torn down, and we don't know what happened to the uniform. There are family trunks, and they're in the process of trying to figure out what to do with the trunks. And I keep saying, if you find a uniform, let me know. I'll run up there and take a picture of it.
Yeah. Wow.
Because there's so much history. I mean, I knew someone whose father was in the Civil War. I mean, to me, that's very unique, because the Civil War is over 155 years ago, maybe.
Wow. So if we were to fast forward, 5-6 years ago, tell us, like, for people that don't know anything about what's been going on there, tell us sort of like what was starting to pop up here and there with your work and Lindsay, and what was the very beginnings, the genesis? I know Pennsylvania Humanities was involved at the early. So tell us that the very beginning story of how, and then we can get into more of the church and yeah.
In 2016, the Heart and Soul Initiative. It was in Carlisle, but they were collecting stories. And during the course of collecting stories,
Heart and Soul, real quick for listeners, is a Pennsylvania Humanities Council initiative partnering with a foundation, right?
Yes,
Orton
the
Family
Orton Family Foundation.
Okay.
And they were collecting stories. And during the course of collecting the stories of Carlisle and surrounding areas, they were told you should talk to the Gumby sisters. They live on Mountain Street, and they their family has been in Mount Holly for years and years, and that they have a story. You should, try and talk to them. And there's a certain amount of distrust, someone calling up saying, I'd like to come to your house and collect your story. So there was a certain amount of distrust, and it took a number of calls. And as in any small town, one of the neighbors that grew up, David Toner, who happens to be on our board, basically talked to them and said, yeah, you should talk. These are good people. And then the pharmacist over at the pharmacy said to Harriet and Edna, if they're good people, you should talk to them. So they allowed them to come to their home, and they talked to them. And I think it took a couple talks before they were able to actually record the story. And that was 2016.
And the Historical Society's doing this in partnership with?
Yes, the Cumberland County Historical Society was doing this in partnership. So the wonderful thing about all of this is when I tell the story, you'll see how things just keep bumping into each other. And when you have one story, it leads into another story. So the Cumberland County Historical Society was part of this. And that led eventually to Lindsay Varner working for the Cumberland County Historical Society. And during the course of collecting the story, Harriet Gumby said that she was concerned about the legacy of her grandfather. Her grandfather was formerly enslaved and fought in the Civil War. And she said he's buried, and she pointed to a cemetery out the back window that was off to the right. He's buried right over there along with my mother and father. And she had some brothers, a brother and two sisters. And she said, and the church. And to hear Lindsay tell the story, Lindsay looks up and says, what church? And because you couldn't see anything but just a mass of tangled bushes and weeds and vines. And they said the church is behind that in there is a church. So they basically, trotted up Cedar Street, and if you go online, you'll see of our website, you'll see a series of pictures that show you just what it looked like. The door was locked. They pried a window open and shoved Pam Steele through the window, and she pried the door open. And when you go in, it's like a time capsule. There are hymnals on the pews. It was in bad shape, and it continues to be in bad shape, but not for long. Basically, that's what started. And right after that, there was a United Way Day of Caring where we got volunteers, and that's how I got involved. I had a phone call that said they're going to be cleaning out the church. Do you want to be part of it? And I'm like, yes, because every time the 30 years that I was not living here, and when I would come home on holidays, I would say, Mom, what's happening with the church? And she'd say, not a thing, not a thing.
Just sitting there. Yeah. Just
sitting there. So for 50 years, almost 50 years, it sat there abandoned because it did have a trustees, but as the trustees died, the last trustee was Harriet Gumby's father. He died in 1986. So from that point on, there wasn't anyone taking care of the building, and the cemetery was being cut periodically by someone that the Gumby sisters were paying out of their own pocket to have the cemetery cut. But they were just cutting it. There was no love in the care. There was like just a job,
mow it
cut
down
and move it down. Yeah. And so it started with just that. And that group of volunteers, which are historians, preservationists, people that live in the town, or in Mount Holly, or live in neighboring Carlisle, and former descendants as well we have in the group. And out of that grew the Mount Tabor Preservation Project.
So
And
initially it was a gather the stories and clean it up kind of initiative.
and what are we going to do with it?
And then
What's the best, and what's the best thing to do with it? I'm going to tell you, for a number of years, I thought that it would probably be taken down and maybe just the foundation left there with some interpretive signs talking about history. We thought that was the best we could do. We didn't want that to happen, but we knew that the money, we had a cursory estimate done, and which was well over $300,000, and that was like years ago, and we didn't have 50 cents at the time.
I thought
So
it's buried in those mattresses at your mother's place.
no, and it's not buried part.
Oh, Carmen, you're we lost your audio there. We'll try to get her.
Coins in a jar. Okay, I think I'm back on. I get a flash.
Yeah, what were you saying?
He used to bury his money in mason jars throughout his little plot. So, periodically you'd hear that story, but we did an archaeological dig and there are no jars, there is no money. That's just one of those stories that it seems that the more colorful the story, the longer it lasts. Yeah. And that's one.
So now this group is loosely formed of a lot of caring people, and the idea is, okay, we've got to formalize a little bit.
All right.
Is that what's happening?
Yes. And so out of that grew about a group of 8. We decided on a name, but we needed a sponsor, and Cumberland County Historical Society became our fiscal sponsor, because we knew that our group would be the for lack of a better term, friends up, the keeper of deciding what would be the best for the building and the cemetery, because we knew it was a piece of history. For some of us, it was more emotional than it was historical. There's an emotional tie to it for the descendants and the former congregants. There's a historical preservation need for some of us, and that's a good blend to have, because we bounce off of each other as far as what's the best thing to do. So based on that, we worked with the Cumberland County Historical Society, which gave us lots of opportunity to tell our story, to formalize a process, to get an idea together. We knew we needed to write grants, and we didn't have an owner, because there was no owner. At the bishop's level in Baltimore, they had no record of the building, so therefore they were reluctant to say, yes, you can have it and do something with. So we went through a process of working with them, and that took over a year. For them to work with the borough of Mount Holly Springs, which was gracious enough to step up and take ownership in 2019. Okay. They took ownership of the building, and we were able to start writing grants because we then had an owner. In the meantime, there were our story was in the newspaper, the local newspaper, also on Penn Live, and we would receive phone calls. We received a phone call from Senator Regan's office that said, I don't want anything, I just want to know how I can help. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, we had a fence, because one of the stories that Harriet told in protecting the legacy of her family was kids were playing on the cemetery because it was open, and there was only 15 headstones actually there, 15 or 16 headstones that are actually there. And so they were playing soccer and so she was concerned. And right away, we were able to receive a fence, and an Eagle Scout did a project of putting it up along with volunteers from the neighborhood and from the Mount Tabor Preservation Project. And we have a black fence that's now very nice, very stable, very straight. That was one thing we wanted to make sure, that it was sturdy and straight, and it looks great. And that's another story. Someone just unsolicited contacted us and said, this is a piece of history that needs to be protected. And he continues to help, because we recently received a grant of $275,000 from the Department of Community and Economic Development. It's the DCED, 275,000. And that, coupled with the other grants that we've been able to write over the course from the end of 2019 to this year, we now have a total of over 300,000, which looks like, if it doesn't get us to the end of the restoration, it'll get us awfully close in grants. We'll write more grants.
What was the name of the church early on? What did the community call the church in the early years?
They called it it started out Mount Tabor AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and then it eventually became Zion. And there is a difference between AME Episcopal and AME Zion. I'm the Zion part, and I will tell you that if you get them mixed up, whoever isn't the person you're talking to, the other part of the AME story, they will set you straight quickly. So there is a difference between the Zion and the non-Zion denomination. And the church itself is circa 1870, but there are other dates that are bouncing around. I will tell you that we found a deed that says 1878, and we have the land was purchased for $17 in 1878, which was a lot of money back then. And it was handed to three trustees, Nelson Cooley, Dennis Rideout, and Henry Ward. And we have a headstone for him. He is one of our Civil War veterans that's buried in the cemetery that's in close proximity to the church. And it was also given to the in charge of the minister at that time, whose last name was Given, to build the church. But services were held prior to the church. They were held in homes. I remember hearing stories from Harriet's mother about how the different homes would have services or funerals. In fact, the house that I grew up in, this story is that they would have to put the coffin through the front window because the door and the steps were too narrow leading to the second floor to get it through the front door. So it was put through the front window and then laid out under the mantle. So as a kid watching television in that room, you'd always look over and think, ooh, how many people laid there? So you would hear, that it was circulated through the homes. We also have, and we don't have a lot of documentation. We have a lot of stories, but some of the documentation we see advertisements for bush services. So services that were being held outside. And the theory might be that that was where the church was a location that the services may have been were held in maybe that location, because it was pretty wooded and overgrown even when I was a kid, so that you wouldn't be cleaning off to have a bush service every time you wanted to have one. It would probably be in the same, I would think, in my opinion, in the same location where the area would be cleaned off and where people would know where to go to have the service. But eventually the land was provided for the church. It's log and cladding, both pine logs, pine cladding. And it's 1.5 stories, with the 1 story being the logs, and then the half is wood structure. And I've never been in the second floor, and we've done interviews with descendants that are close. The oldest is 89. And I always say, what's the second floor look like? And they're like, we were told never to go up there. And I was told never to go up there, and I never went. So, and they didn't go up there. We were obedient people, evidently. But there were people that did go up. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so it's like this, there's this beautiful apple pie, use an analogy, and you have all these ingredients. Like, what had to happen with the community, with like, what are all these ingredients? I mean, you got to have the right people. Like, how did the stars align that this project could manifest itself? And
The,
um,
the, I
yeah,
think the stars aligned with the collection, with the Heart and Soul initiative, with the collecting of the stories. And then it took someone that I want to say was outside of the bubble, that moved into the bubble, that could look at it and say, this is history. If you're looking at it and you're real close, you don't always see it.
hmm,
It becomes the norm. You don't realize that it's really valuable because you live with it every day. So
yeah,
that I think it took Lindsay to say, you have 7 USCT veterans living there. And I'm like, USCT, United States Colored Troops. And I know, oh, Civil War veterans. I didn't realize that. It was just a weedy field when you're passing in it with the creepy cemetery, when you're walking up the lane to go to church Sunday school every Sunday. You don't realize that you hear the stories of Civil War, but quite frankly, you don't get a lot of it in grade school. You don't, they brush, this is it. It was the war, the North won, Lincoln was assassinated, and then you move
right.
on. So you don't really realize it. It took outsiders looking and saying, this is a piece of history. This is value. And we always loved it. We always cared about it. But it was because it was what we used, for lack of a better reason. You ask about what it was like growing up. I mean, it was 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, it was a segregated church with a segregated cemetery because of segregation. So you
Right.
make the best out of what you have. So it was a very close knit community where you grew up, you listened to your elders, everybody was watching. If you did something wrong, you knew you were going to get told on. So it was a very close knit community. And it took someone or a group of people looking and saying, this is a piece of history that needs to be told, not
Mm,
just told within the people that lived it or bumped into it periodically, but it's a piece of history that needs to be told. And as I said, Mount Holly Springs has a population of less than 2,000
mm,
people. So, the people, not everybody, newcomers to the town wouldn't know about it. I mean, even now we hear people that say, oh, I didn't know there was a church up there. Well, it was covered in vines, and the vines were poison ivy. So
mm,
we think that's what basically saved it. Harriet says that God's hand is on the project. So you ask, but yeah, and I tell you, outside forces. I will tell you that sometimes I sit back, or we'll look at each other when we're talking about something good that's just happened, and say, Harriet says God's hand is on the project. Because if it wasn't for the collection of stories, if it wasn't for Lindsay, and Pam looking at collecting a story and seeing that it was a piece of history, if it wasn't for the historical society stepping up and saying, yeah, this is a piece of history that needs to be told. This is a piece of Cumberland County history. Not all Cumberland County history is white. I'm sorry. There is
mm,
a big piece of not only African American, there's also Greek, Orthodox Greek. There's also Hispanic. There's a whole group. Cumberland County is central, and it's located in a very good area for agriculture, for the beauty of the mountains and hiking, and for the fresh water, the industry, the paper mills. Mount Holly at one time had fact
or okay.
fact ore industry, lumber industry, textile. They made rugs, they made clothing, and paper, and we still have 2 paper mills in Mount Holly Springs. So and next to where I live, which is right in back of the church, there's a big field, and on the other side is Boiling Springs, and there they have history that for the Underground Railroad, which although we cannot document anything, it's hard for me to believe that 3 miles away, 3 or 4 miles away, there was someone that was literally fined $5,000 for their Underground Railroad activity, that they would skip the African American community in Mount Holly Springs to get there or
Mm,
come from there. So,
right.
but we have that's another story.
Yeah. So it seems like what could inspire a lot of, because there are probably Mount Tabors thousands of them, these types all over the country. And it seems to be that it would have been really easy to just look up at those vines and just say, you know what, we don't have 300,000, $500,000, and just, it seems to be like this was what helped everyone along was these little victories.
Yes.
And the little victories created, a little bit more of a ripple effect. And then, the snowball just was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a real lesson to be learned, that just go after that next little victory. And the first one was that story, recording the story.
Recording the story. It's like in business, we used to talk about dissecting the elephant. You put the elephant on the table, the elephant looks huge and you want to walk away, because what are you going to do with that big elephant? You have to dissect it a little piece at a time. And it may take years. It took us 5 years to get to where we are today, with the realization that, we might be able to, we will be able to get this piece of history saved, and it's being recognized nationally. We're still working on that state recognition, but I mean, that's just another piece of the elephant that we will be working on. And it's have a goal at the end, but know that you're not going to get there in 24 hours. You've got to, outline your strategy and decide what you need to do, and knowing that you might have to adjust your strategy. When we started out, we had phases that we were going to go through as far as the restoration of the church. The roof isn't going to wait for phase 5. The roof has to be 1B. So know that you have to change your priorities based on what the building tells you. And we always look at it and say, tell us your story. And it's been a 5-year journey, but we've been, very lucky. And it started like the collecting of the story. And I want to make sure that I talk about this, because Elias Parker fought in the Civil War. He was born in 1829 and he died in 1898. He's buried in our cemetery on Cedar Street. He belonged to he fought in the Civil War. He was Company I, 38th Regiment. He was honorably discharged. He paid 6 cents for his knapsack. So I'm telling you his story, Jason. He paid 6 cents for his knapsack. He was discharged in Texas. They only gave him transportation to New Orleans. So he had to get from New Orleans back to Maryland on his own. And that's one thing I didn't realize. And I had to look that up. I'm like, Maryland, because it said that he joined the Union Army in Maryland. And I'm like, but Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line. So I looked it up, and it said that to the west and to the north of Baltimore was was a Union sympathizers. And in the South, where the farmers were, the South and the West was the Confederacy sympathizers. But they kept Maryland Union because DC was located there, and they were afraid that if it went to the South, that the capital would be surrounded. And so I didn't realize that. And that's another story. It might be a little boring, but it's like, well, how could he join the Union Army in Maryland? So you'd have to do some research. But anyway, he walked over after his first wife died, he left Maryland and he walked over the mountain with his Aunt Ethel. And she carried lilac cuttings in her apron. I'm not quite sure what kind of apron, but this is the story the family tells. And those lilacs are still on Mountain Street. They're a little straggly now. And they're, to me, an invasive kind of bush, but we still have them. And he walked over the mountain, and that's where he met his wife. And he married her, and they had children, which Anna or Harriet Anna, everyone in Mount Holly called her Anna Gumby. I called her Grandma Gumby. She was one of his children. And he had one daughter that lived to be 103, I think. Her name was, they called her Maisie, but her name was Marietta. And she was named Marietta because her brother, I think, named her. I might be wrong on that. And he was working in Marietta, Pennsylvania. And so they called her Marietta. But she was Aunt May's, and she lived to be over 100.
So he built the church after he had moved there.
After he moved there, he
Okay.
was a carpenter and a mason. So we know he did the foundation with the South Mountain stone. That we know was new. The building, we look at the building and we're not sure if the building was that he built it or it was recycled. We do know some people have looked at our logs and say that the logs are in the 1860s. So if the church was circa 1870, it may have been recycled or the logs were used from something else. But
Okay.
he is the person that family history has built the church. And as I said, it's log constructed. It's one of the oldest AME Zion log constructed with cladding churches in Cumberland County.
Hmm.
And it's recognized for being that, as well as the National Registry of Historic Places that just came through last week.
Yeah.
So
So tell us about that. It's just put on the register.
just put on the registry, and we're so proud. And we're now. We had always talked about where are we going to get what is our sign going to look like, and I took pictures at the 2 Mile House, which is part of the Cumberland County Historical Society, and I took pictures of the signs at the Amelia S. Gibbons Library in Mount Holly that also has the same recognition. And so I take pictures of all these signs so we can decide what ours is going to look like. And now, we can basically go out and buy it, and we're talking about what it's going to look like and where it's going to be, but we're very proud of that. We had originally applied for a state marker from the state of Pennsylvania, and we were declined, which was that was when you have so many successes and so many happy stories. When you get a decline, I still get teary about it.
Hmm.
But we have an opportunity. We have two more times to apply, so we're hoping that maybe they'll think that we're worthy of a state marker.
I wonder if it's like one of those picking a Hall of Famer in the NFL. There's like they just have to sort of they want to say yes to all the great players, but they can't ever say yes to everyone every year.
and
Okay.
and they did say that they don't do churches and cemeteries, and
Hmm.
we were talking about our community, but how can you talk about a community when the church and the cemetery grew out of it? It was all seamless to us. um,
Hmm.
so we'll just have to go back again and see if we can word it differently.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to hear about how this project has brought different community members together. I mean, that's a question that historians will get sometimes, people that work in preservation. Well, what's the point of all of this? Like, how does it really, um, how can it really help a community? Have you seen um, people in Mount Holly being more galvanized, that maybe having a little bit more spark in their step or a sense of purpose? Or, I mean, not to say that they didn't before, but has the project brought people together in Mount Holly or inspired them in maybe ways that they just felt they weren't as inspired before the project? Or
I think yes, and I think the biggest example is the borough of Mount Holly Springs taking ownership of both the building and the cemetery, and
wow.
it was easy. I keep saying, because we were supposed to meet with a borough council member, and we were waiting in the parking lot. And for some reason, there was a family emergency and she didn't come. This is another story. So we're standing there, and the police chief, Chief Day, who was also the borough manager, came out and said, "You guys are waiting out here. You're waiting for somebody. If you want to come in." And we said, "Well, we were waiting who we were waiting for. They wanted to talk about Mount Tabor." He said, "Well, why don't you come in? You can talk to me if you want till she gets here." And so we went in and we told our story. And he said, "That seems like a workable thing." He said, "There might, I said, "Well, who on the borough do we need to like tell our story to win over?" And so, he gave us a name and guess what? He talked to them, and we didn't have to win anybody over.
Hmm.
It was a unanimous vote that they would take ownership, which put it put insurance on the building under the borough, which was, in the back of your mind, you always worry, is it going to fall down? Is it going to burn? People had said, oh, I'm surprised someone didn't burn it down. And I'm like, who would do that?
Mm.
And but, the fact that the borough took ownership, seamlessly took ownership. And, the bishop and Bishop Moore in Maryland, Baltimore, Maryland, worked with us. It gave us a lovely package, sold it to them for $1. It was once the snowball started rolling down the hill, we didn't have to push it in. We may have formed it. We may have kept it rolling for a while, but once it picked up momentum, and it's not at the bottom of the hill yet, but it's nice and big. And when it gets there, it's going to be beautiful. It just seemed like, the Senator Regan's office calling unsolicited. Hey, we saw your story in the Sentinel newspaper. Is there anything we can help you with? Oh my gosh. Who does that? So we take our gifts, we make sure we send out our thank you letters quickly, and donations started rolling in. We got a website, we have our website is mounttaborpreservation.com, and there is a donation button.
I'll put that up.
And we have a Facebook link that has a donation button. We have Amazon Smile, which you can click on when you're buying an Amazon. So everything it's falling into place, so that when we didn't get the state marker, that was a reality check that said, don't get so cocky. It's all not going to, you're going to have to work a little hard. That's God's message saying, it's not going to be so easy. You got to work a little bit harder. So, but the National Registry is, and all the people that helped with getting that, and I will say Lindsay was a big part of knowing where to put us. She didn't have the time to do everything, but she positioned us in front of right answers. And that's a sign of a good leader. They'll know that there are right answers and put you in front of the right answer, and you pick the one that's best for you. That'll get the same result, but will get it when you're comfortable. Someone's not telling you what to do. They're putting you in front of it and say, okay, make it happen. Yeah. So one thing I want to say, I have to tell you this story. We have 7 Civil War veterans buried in our little cemetery, which to me, I know that there are cemeteries that have a lot more, but we're talking about less than 2,000 people, 1800s. We have 7 USCT, United States Colored Troop veterans. And one of the stories that I always tell, because it's important when you're telling your stories, if you're going to engage people, it's got to hit their heart. I say hit their heart. That'll help with the wallets. So our story is of Richard Jordan. And I said before, we don't have a lot of documentation, but we found his obituary. We found it through Janet Washington. She was Bell. When I went to school with her, she was Washington. She wrote a book about Lincoln Cemetery in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, but in there she had other articles. And I found his obituary in her book. Okay. It said that Richard Jordan was born in Macon, Georgia. He was brought to Gettysburg by his owner, who was a Confederate soldier. During the course of the Battle of Gettysburg, he escaped and found his way to Mount Holly. Okay. He went to Chambersburg and joined the Union Army. He fought in the Union Army, was honorably discharged, came back to Mount Holly, was very active in the church, was a team master for the paper mill that's at the end of Mountain Street that's still there. And he was a member of the GAR, very active in the church, and he's buried in our cemetery. That's a piece of documentation that we have. And he was given a new headstone because his old one you couldn't read. And Tony Zizzi did the paperwork with the Veterans Administration and installed a new headstone for him. Wow. And in front of the old one. So I tell you that because I want to end with something that the people that are looking at your podcast will hear and want to visit, because part of the grant process that we did, especially with the 275,000, is to get people engaged, to come visit us, to listen to our story, to hear the history, to know that not every African American community can have a famous basketball player or a famous musician. We don't, although we think we do, but we can't document it. We don't have famous people. We have engaged people who love a building, who love a cemetery, who love a project, and we want to share that information with as many people as we can. As I said, because of our preservation and our renovation process, you're going to be limited to being able to go inside the church. So we do have a tour, a video. Some people say it's a little long, so I suggest if you go onto our website and take the tour. It's a YouTube tour. You sit back with your popcorn and your favorite beverage, and it'll walk you through, because we wanted to document the past, because once it's done, it's going to be newer. It's still going to have a past. But we wanted to make sure that you saw our acne, because it's like having acne and then you don't have acne and you have a beautiful complexion. We want to document the story behind it. So we encourage you to go in and take the tour, because of COVID, we couldn't have tours. So that limited people seeing us. And we know once construction starts, it's going to limit what they're going to be able to see.
So the hope is that working with the town, what's one of the steps along the way, the vision, so to speak, of what your hope is for the property in the years to come? Is it like a place for the community to gather? What's the thought?
We're working on that, and we're looking at three things right now, and the importance of those three things may shift, they may shrink, and they may expand, but we're looking at making it a museum type, and just sharing the history, bringing in groups. Right now, the Cumberland County Historical Society, Matthew brings third graders over, and they hear the story. They love the cemetery, the stories of the cemetery. But so we want to work with the local school and the local historical society, Cumberland County Historical Society, and bringing people through to hear the history. We also want to do training there. There's because it's located at the base of the South Mountain, there's so much of the South Mountain that we can share and show how it's a part of the building. There's also, we're on what I call the Civil War corridor. We're currently on the Civil War visitors information for automobiles and cyclists, or motorcycles. We get a number of motorcycles. So we want to be there for tourists. So we're looking at tourists, we're looking at education, we're looking at the South Mountain and how that piece of nature, because if it wasn't located where it is, it that helped buffer it from some of the weather. So those are the three things that we're looking at. The African American history. This is an African American historical community, so that's part of talking about the church as well. So those are three areas. It's the history, education, and we have had people that have contacted us and said they'd like to have weddings there, which that would be okay, or renewal services, or maybe an early morning sunrise Easter service or something. So we know that going forward, we're going to have to have a plan, working with the Borough of Mount Holly Springs, on how to make it profitable, because we don't want to draw on taxpayer dollars. And luckily, other than the legal work, we have been through the Mount Tabor Preservation Project and through donations that have come in and through our grants. We're not drawing on the taxpayer dollars. We want to be self-sufficient, and we want to make sure that it stood for approximately 150 years. We want to make sure that it's standing even better for another 150 plus years. So that's I don't know if I answered your question. I tend to talk a lot.
That's good. I really hope that if people share this video or they tune in, that other communities can be inspired by the story of Mount Tabor, and because it shows what just how things can blossom, and some dedicated people and folks with rich history sharing their stories, how things can develop. And it's thank you for for sharing all of that with me.
Thanks for inviting, because if it's not, I mean, with you asking and putting this out there, people will hear more. And so it's a gift to us to listen to our stories. As I said, there's not a lot of documentation that we have. We just have our stories, a collection of our stories. So we're very fortunate and thank you.
Yeah. All right. You ready for the lightning round?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Would you rather be walking along the boardwalk or the beach?
Beach.
That was easy, huh? You don't all the noise and it's
Beach.
just too much. Okay. If you were able to jump into a story, a book, would you jump into Alice in Wonderland or Wizard of Oz?
Wizard. Wait. I'm a scary kind of person. I wouldn't jump into either one of them.
You want to go neither one?
Neither one. Neither one. They're both creepy stories.
They are pretty creepy. All right. You're sitting down at the end of a hot summer day. You have a choice. You either grab an ice cream sandwich or an ice cream cone.
Ice cream cone.
Oh, yeah. Does it bring back memories?
Yeah. Ice cream cone, Nutty Buddy. They used to be a quarter. I would go to Henry's and get them, and you'd unwrap the paper and take it off the top and put it in the trash, and then you would just bite into the chocolate nutty top.
Was that a local place in Mount Holly?
Yes, it was a local store. We had two supermarkets, Arnold's, which I started working at when I was 15, and then Henry's. And Henry's is the only one that carried the Nutty Buddies. Arnold's didn't carry Nutty Buddies.
So, well, this has been a lot of fun, and I will make sure all those links get up posted in the video. I'll throw up not only Mount Tabor's links, but I'll put some of the Heart and Soul links up, and Humanities Council, and
Cumberland County Historical Society, because they have our chairs. We did a 10-minute talk. Our chairs are on.
Okay, I'll put that link up as well. And thanks again, Carmen.
Thank you. It's nice seeing you, Jason, and thank you for sharing our stories with everybody.
Sure. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.